Alright, folks, it's Watchman here. So, today I wanted to talk about why the U.S. should defend Taiwan. Now, a little bit about me, a little bit about this channel. I am a United States Infantry veteran. I served in Korea as a forward operating deployed force against China, against North Korea. And then I self-deployed myself to the war in Ukraine in 2022 to fight on the front lines, where I did get wounded on the front lines. That's a little bit about me. Now, I'm going to hopefully share a little bit about what I know, and hopefully I know it, and it's not just something I think I know. So let's see here. Why the United States must defend Taiwan. So the first case I want to make is that China is an enemy. China has always been our enemy since they became communists. There was nothing that the United States could have done about it. There was nothing that we could have prevented it. It's just the way it is. They are communists. They've always been communists since they took over in the 50s, right? Communists have always hated America. If you ever listen to a communist, a true communist, not some leftist in America, but a true communist speak, you will see that their goal is global domination. That there's this thing called global communism. Marx believed in it. Lenin believed in it. Xi Jinping believes in it. Global communism is the belief that communism must spread through any means necessary. If it's peaceful, that's great, but chances are it won't be. And so the fact is that we need to do it violently. And this violently can be done by two methods. It can be either done by outright external invasion. Think of the Soviets invading half of Europe after World War II, bringing communism. Or it can be through internal revolution, through guerrilla fighters, whatever it may be. Right? We've seen this play out in many cases around the world. So, the goal of communists is to control the world for global domination. Okay, communists have more of an ambition to control the world than Britain ever did. Britain might have gotten closer. Debatable. But they never had the ambition, right? The British Empire was a huge conglomeration of many different people, many different ideologies, many different personalities, right? All clashing with each other. It wasn't one big thing. The communists, on the other hand, are different. They are lockstep and key with each other. With their intelligence services, with the Politburos, with everything. Now, they want global domination. Why does that make the enemy the U.S.? Well, why does that make the U.S. an enemy? Because the U.S., through our global-led order, through our freedom of the seas, patrolling the oceans with our Navy, through the current system that exists today, a multilateral system that exists today, this prevents China from expanding. This prevents communists from expanding. If your idea is so great, communists, then your idea should be sufficient even with the US-led global order intact, right? People should just want to do it voluntarily, but that's another topic. So, through this system, the United States, we're preventing them, right? Obviously, we're supporting Taiwan, we're, the Philippines, but, it's more than that. It's the whole system, right? They want to bring down the whole system. This is why the war in Ukraine wasn't just about Ukraine and Russian-speaking people in the East. This was about the system, right? Putin talks about bringing down the global system all the time. This is what BRICS is about. This is what, getting rid of the world reserve currency of the US dollar is all about, right? We know that, the Chinese and the Russians, they don't like the system. The communists do not like the system. Now, the Chinese are actually a little bit more dependent upon the system, right? The Russians have already been sanctioned, so that's in the past, right? The Chinese are making lots of money off the system right now, so until the point that it becomes not worth it to continue on in the system, then they'll be more aggressive. And we saw this happen with the Japanese, right? Japanese were actually pretty dependent on trade up until World War II and up until the 30s with the Great Depression, really. Shutting down global trade, let's see what happens with China. But let's not get off topic. So back to Taiwan. Why is Taiwan important here? Why is Taiwan important here? So we have a map. Before we get to that, actually, I want to deal with this quote. So this is from Elbridge Colby. Okay, he's the, what is he? He's like the third in command of the DoD. Elbridge Colby. He's the third in command of the DoD. It's the United States Secretary of Defense for Policy, right? So he's big on policy, okay? Of course. Foreign policy. And he was also in the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2018, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Deployment. Just talking about how he focuses on China. So yeah. Oh no, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Oh yeah, that's what I said. Okay. So he said this quote: "Everything should be going to Asia to deal with the Chinese threat. We will have to deprioritize everything else." So this kind of puts it in perspective of what, why is the Trump administration doing what they're doing? I'm not going to defend their actions. If I was president, I might do it differently. But this makes sense of why they're doing what they're doing, right? China is the biggest threat. The administration clearly sees this, right? They're not going to be soft on China. We know that. So we have to deprioritize everything else. This is why they don't really, not that interested in funding Ukraine. By the way, right now, to this date, we still are funding Ukraine. But this is why they're trying to get the Europeans to spend more on it, right? To take their own defense more seriously, because we have the Chinese threat to deal with. So why is Taiwan so important? Because you can assume, the Chinese threat, what does that mean? Okay, so it means that, that Taiwan, right? It means the Philippines. It means, the South China Sea, right? Taiwan's the big one. Taiwan is the big one. This is what we're talking about. Why is Taiwan such a big threat? So there's two reasons, right? There's really the, security reasons. And there's economic reasons. So most people know of the economic reasons, right? TSMC, right? Everybody knows about TSMC, right? This great company. So TSMC, it's almost a state corporation, right? Not technically, I think, but it is Taiwan's largest company, it says. And they get heavily subsidized by the government, so they're almost a state corporation, but not not in the same sense as Chinese communist, right? So TSMC, they make the most advanced chips in the world. Okay, so you can say, oh, TSMC, they announced a $500 billion investment in the U.S. recently, right, to beat the Trump tariffs or blah blah blah. The U.S. can do it. We just get a foreign investment. Okay. TSMC CEO already said that the most advanced chips are made in Taiwan, and they will always be made in Taiwan. Yeah, that's the end of that story, right? They can invest as much money as they want in the U.S., but, they're going to make the most advanced chips in Taiwan for this national security concern, right? Because they want to be important. And, they'll make other chips in other countries, right? Philippines has a semiconductor industry. Malaysia does. Even communist China does, right? The United States does. But we don't make the most advanced ones, okay? The important thing is making the most advanced ones. Sure, you can get a computer chip from a, laptop that's 15 years old. Is that chip going to be any good, for editing a video today? Probably not, right? So this is the point, right? We want the most advanced chips. We don't want those most advanced chips to go into China, right? China takes over Taiwan, they get the factories, and then theoretically they get the intellectual information, the blueprints, whatever. They get the machinery, they understand how they were doing things. There's talk about blowing it up, right? The TSMC founder, well, for what it's worth, he thinks that even if you don't blow it up and even if, you leave everything there, and China's not going to be able to do it anyways because they don't have the culture of freedom and the innovation of their people, right? Communism just holds things back. That's the argument there. So, the economic argument, we're dependent on them for the computer chips. Everybody knows this. No, it's not really that good of an argument because we can make them somewhere else, right? Taiwan has always been important for longer reasons than that. Okay, the TSMC is a new reason. Okay, but we can look, right? Like, why was it important before that? Let me go back to my screen share here. So we have the first Taiwan Strait crisis, right? So that's funny. It must have been, after they became important or something. No, it was 1955. 1954 to 1955. It lasted for 7 months, right? The United States was involved. We actually had 2 people killed during this. Okay? And, basically we had to send the U.S. Navy. We helped, the U.S. Navy helped ROC troops evacuate some islands. And, there was a concern that, the United States was going to invade, China was going to invade Taiwan here, right? So we cared about this situation before the computer chips ever got involved, right? So the question will be, why? Okay. Now, let's read Truman's statement here, because this seems interesting. The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war. It has defied the orders of the Security Council of the United Nations issued to preserve the international peace and security. In these circumstances, the occupation of Formosa by communist forces would be a direct threat to the security of the Pacific area and to the United States forces performing their lawful and necessary functions in that area. Accordingly, I have ordered the 7th Fleet to prevent any attack on Formosa as a corollary of this action. I am calling upon the Chinese government of Formosa to cease all sea and air operations against the mainland, and the 7th Fleet will see that this is done. Determination on the future status of Formosa must await the restoration of the security of the Pacific, a peace settlement with Japan, and considerations by the United Nations. So that was the talk going on at that time. And he mentions that, China attacked Korea. And it's clear that, basically that China attacked Korea, right? The Korean War was not a war between South Korea and North Korea. It was not a war between South Korea and the U.S. and North Korea. It was a war between China and the U.S., right? China had 1 million soldiers who came and fought against American soldiers. And so Truman basically said, well, it's obvious that they're pretty hostile, right? Next is Taiwan. So, we sent a fleet to defend them. Why is Taiwan important? So this map really shows it, but here, first let's go to the Google. So you have Japan. You have Japan, South Korea, right? China's over here. Commies are over here, right? Japan and Korea are mutual defense allies, right? We have the strongest alliance possible with Korea and Japan. You look in Japan. This is their last island, right? Then they have many other islands. All these islands. All these islands. All these islands. Keep going. They just keep going, right? All the way to Taiwan. So it's like a string of islands all the way to Taiwan. Taiwan is in that string of islands, you could say almost. Possibly. And you have Okinawa. Okinawa is in one of those islands, right? Okinawa, you probably heard of it, right? You have thousands of Marines who are stationed there. huge military, U.S. military presence. Well, it's Japanese military, right? Kind of in China's way if they want to access the Pacific, right? Kind of in a perfect position to defend Taiwan, right? Halfway in between Japan, not too crazy far. Look at the other islands, right? I mean, this is a Japanese island here. What's it? 200 kilometers, right? And then another island, of course, right here. But, we're taking the big one here. And only 200 kilometers from Taiwan, to Japan. Not a hard thing for a navy to close. Not even a navy, an army. Just station some anti-ship missiles on the island, and you close that channel. Next is Philippines. Another mutual defense ally of the United States. They're actually used to be a U.S. territory, so they're possibly one of our strongest allies in the world. Philippines also has islands leading up to Taiwan. Right here. But the Bataan Islands. They're also not far away at all. Less than 200 miles. 160 kilometers. Yeah, about 200 miles. Right now, the United States is doing training right here on the Bataan Islands. So right now, you have the Chinese Navy. They are the largest navy in the world. Should be said that they're not the largest by tonnage, but they are the largest by sheer number of ships. Whether it's by tonnage or ship numbers, that should be concerning. The Chinese Navy is currently headquartered at Hainan Island here. You have the South China Sea. They have made some military bases in the Paracel Islands and further down in the Spratlys, right? The Navy, they're all, most of them are headquartered in Hainan. It's like the Hawaii of China. We have the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquartered in Hawaii. If China takes Taiwan, what's the next obvious, where do you think their Navy's going to go? Their Navy's going to go to Taiwan. That'll be their new headquarters, right? Then they're threatening the Philippines, right? Now they have access out to the global ocean. You can see that very clearly here, right? They would have access to the global ocean. Taiwan would really make them a global superpower. So, how do we have the argument so far? China's communist. Communists believe in global communism. They want to destroy anything that gets in their way. They want global domination. The main thing that gets in their way to global domination is the United States-led order. Taiwan is the first step. If you take Taiwan, now you can branch out to be a naval power. There's lots and lots of benefits to being a naval power versus being a land power. Naval powers traditionally can extend their influence, right? As a land power, you really can't extend your influence. You can defend your borders, but there's no force projection around the world. There's no expeditionary forces with armies. Navies, there is. You can be a global superpower. Right now, China is not a global superpower. Why? No navy. Another important factor to understand here. So what, a 5,000-mile boat ride from Shanghai to the Persian Gulf? This is where China gets all of their energy right there here, from Iran, from the Persian Gulf. They have to go all the way here past India. India, China, not that friendly. Then they have to sail through the Straits of Malacca, go past the United States Naval Base, that's stationed here in Singapore, and then continue on their way through the South China Sea with all those enemies that they made recently. And then they have to go past Taiwan to then get to Shanghai, whatever it may be, right? They want to secure those passageways, obviously. What country wouldn't? So, being a naval power is pretty important to China. Since they are an enemy of the United States, it's pretty important for us not to let them be a naval power. Oh, I did not share that screen the last time. So, being a naval power is important for China to secure their resources, right? To be a global power, to pursue their global communism goals. Let me go back to my screen share here. So, what I was talking about is, from the Persian Gulf, you sail past India, you go through the Straits of Malacca, past the U.S. Naval Base there, right? Then you're in the South China Sea, going past all these enemies, Then you have to go past Taiwan, all the way to, a major city, Shanghai or something, right? Pretty long, tenuous boat ride. They need a navy to secure that. They need a navy to project power. So look at the Taiwan situation again. This would be kind of from their perspective, right? So you have the red lines here, the first island chain. You have the second island chain, which is Guam. Okay. China would break out of the first island chain if they take Taiwan. It would be like a huge monumental thing. You can see here the maritime space, right? This is an interesting one. See, many shipping routes going through the first island chain. So the situation, you could argue, is similar to World War II. This is a map of World War II, of before World War II, right? So you have the United States over here in blue, you have Japan over here in red. Japan already started their invasion of China. Japan is controlling Taiwan at this time. The United States controls the Philippines. Here, the United States is controlling Guam, but everything around Guam is controlled by Japan. That's why that's a red circle. So Marshall Islands, way over here, is controlled by Japan. Besides that, the United States has Wake Island, Midway, Hawaii. Our position is very, very stretched compared to what it is today. So you put this in perspective, it looks, China is in a much worse situation here. Okay, so what was Japan's goal, right? What was they wanted their their East Asian co-prosperity sphere, right? They wanted their Japanese empire. They wanted autarky, which is to be self-sufficient completely on your own merit, on your own country's resources. That's why they invaded China. Okay. So one thing to understand about China is it's an empire. Okay, China is an empire. They've always been an empire. They're ruling over other people, right? If you look at the Han ethnic majority, they control the most populous, they control the most fertile areas of the country. Okay, how did that happen? Because of conquest, right? The Han are ruling over other ethnic groups. You look at the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, you look at the Tibetans, the Hans are the rulers of the empire. They're controlling other people, right? If you look at the history of China, what is some of the top 5 most deadliest wars in the world? You have the transition from the Ming to the Qing, right? You have the Taipei Rebellion, right? I think there's another one that's in the top 3 for China. So, it's World War I, World War II, and then you have Chinese wars for the top deadliest wars, right? The top deadliest wars are always in China. Why is that, right? Because China is not just some unitary state, they don't all agree with each other. They're always fighting for control over this empire, right? What empires do. It's like the Middle East, right? Back in ancient times, Babylon would come, then the Assyrians would take over the Babylonian Empire, then the Persians would take over the same space, right? And it was the same empire, the same place, but different. It was the same geographical boundaries of the Middle East, but different empires were taken over. The Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the later the Ottomans, right? Same geographical area, different empires. So this is China, right? I think the Ming were Manchus, maybe. So the what was it, the Yuan dynasty, they were Mongols. Okay, so in other dynasties they were Han. Okay, so they're an empire. Okay, and this is why it's always been the deadliest wars ever, because China has many people and it's not just one country, right? It's not even a civil war, you could say, that's going on in China, right? Because there's different languages are speaking, different people groups, it's just one social class, one people got tired of being ruled, so they this is their chance to absolutely be the rulers, and subjugate everybody else, and see how they like it. This is kind of what's happening, right? It's like was it a civil war between the Babylonians and the Egyptians or whatever, between the Babylonians and the Byzantines, just because they were fighting over the same space, and at one time the Persians controlled that area, right? No, it wasn't, right? So, you just go back to anything, right? China, this is the point, is Japan invading China. They had to consolidate their power, okay? You had the global trade shut down, you had the expedition when the United States went to Japan, we sent a Navy boat there, and, we forced them to open up. They did. They opened up. They were isolationists before. They opened up, right? And then they become dependent on global trade. Then global trade shuts down because of the tariffs and everything and the global depression, right? The Great Depression shuts down trade. The United States exacerbates the problem by introducing the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. So Japan says, well, nobody's going to trade with us. We were depending on trade before. Let's go to autarky. And how do we do autarky? Well, we're going to invade China, the land of resources, from their eyes. So, then what does Japan want to do? Well, they wanted to invade the Pacific. Why? Why do they want to invade the Pacific? Because they think that the United States was their primary, China was their primary enemy, right? China was the primary enemy of Japan in World War II. And they thought that the United States was going to get in the way of that. Right, they thought the United States was, going to support China. What we were doing, but we did the embargo on Japan, right? So they thought, oh well, knock the United States out of the war, we have nothing to worry about. They were wrong. This is similar, by the way, to China today. Who's the primary enemy of China today? Is it the United States? No. Maybe it's Taiwan, right? Maybe it's Russia, Russia has, they have more grievances, legitimate grievances with Russia. Now the problem is, is ideology. They're communists, right? The KGB is still in power of Russia. So, they're buddies, take over the world together. But, if you look at it from an actual geopolitical point of view, Russia's a bigger enemy, right? They lost a huge chunk of land, almost the size of Alaska or something, to Russia. In the late 1800s, was it, right? China has bigger primary enemies, regional, maybe India, right? Maybe India is their primary enemy, right? It would just make sense that their primary enemy isn't the U.S., because primary enemies to land powers typically aren't naval powers. Typically, the primary enemies to land powers are other land powers. Think of the, Nazi Germany, right? Who was the primary enemy to Nazi Germany? It was the Soviets. It wasn't Britain. It was the Soviets. Now, China thinks that the United States is going to get involved against their primary enemies, so that's why the shift focuses to the United States, just like the shift for Japan focuses to the United States, right? So, I don't know if I completely made sense of the Japanese analogy. I'm kind of just shooting off the hip here. This is a live stream. But the next and final point I wanted to get into is what happens if, what's the consequences if they do take it? What's going to happen to the United States? What could possibly go wrong? They just take Taiwan and just, the people there have to pay taxes to a different authority and that's it, right? And nothing changes much for us or the Americans. I don't think so. So I'm going to go with the domino theory. And I know people have their disagreements with this. This was used during the Cold War, but I think it rings true today. So you have the domino theory. So Taiwan gets taken, and we already established how it's in the first island chain. Okay. So Taiwan is taken. What is going to incentivize America's allies, right? Like what's, here you had a U.S. ally of Taiwan, tried to stand up to China. Well, look at how it turned out for them, right? They got swallowed up. They got screwed over, right? What's going to make the Philippines, for example, or Vietnam, or Thailand, or a number of countries, right? What's going to make them want to cooperate with the United States on our national interests? The Philippines, they might just say, hey, this whole South China Sea dispute, not really worth it. China has a huge military. The Philippines is a poor country. We don't have that. We don't have the capability to stand up to them. The United States, they basically showed here that they can't or they won't defend Taiwan. They don't want to. They don't have the capabilities. We don't want to end up like that, so it's better, hey, let's just cut a deal on the South China Sea dispute, let's just cut a deal, our fishermen might have to suffer or something, but that's fine, we won't have to go to war, we'll just cede the territory of the waters, stop pushing at them, and it'll be good, right? It'll be fine. But now you put your defenses down, right? It's a domino theory, right? You could see the U.S., the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. You could see that torn up. It's not really out of the question, right? Former President Duterte, the last president of the Philippines, he was very pro-China. He has that sentiment, so it's not out of the question when Taiwan gets taken, it's going to embolden people like Duterte, right? You have this new South Korean president. Let's get the exact quote here. So the new South Korean president, the front runner, I should say, to the presidential elections in South Korea right now, he's giving a pro-China stance, that I would say, because I'm critical of China. But this is a really, big concern for me. And just give me the full quote. Well, it's taking too long because ChatGPT doesn't want to give me the full quote. But he basically said, just say thank you to China, thank you to Taiwan, and move on. He said, no matter what unfolds in the Taiwan Strait, no matter what takes place in China-Taiwan relations, it does not concern us. We should just take care of about our livelihoods, and that would be enough. Why does the Yoon administration, the current president, the guy who declared martial law, he's not there anymore, harassed China. This is a big concern. And Korea is already falling to the domino theory, right? The domino theory was not, that it wasn't just fear mongering in the Cold War. The domino theory can go two ways, right? Either one, country A falls, country B falls because they, communism, we're going to do the same thing, revolution. That, in my experience, is what most people think the domino theory is. Vietnam, they'll have a revolution. Next, Cambodia will have a revolution. Okay, there's also the other possibility. Domino theory. Invade Taiwan. Position your military so you can get to the Philippines. Just like Japan did in World War II, right? They were in Taiwan, and then they could position themselves to invade the Philippines, right? You take Taiwan, what's next? Then you have the Philippines. Then you have Palau, right? You have Guam right here. Let's say Guam's out of the question. It's U.S. territory. That's fine, Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands, by the way, has already signed a defense treaty with China. They're already in military cooperation with China. Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands was hugely important for logistics during World War II. You look at the series, The Band of the Pacific, right, of the Marines in World War II. A lot of the logistics, when they go back to their logistic basics, it's always in the Solomon Islands, actually. A lot of them. So Solomon Islands, is really big. That's actually why we're building logistics bases in Papua New Guinea right now. That's why we just signed a treaty with them, actually. The Biden administration signed something new with them. Solomon Islands is here. You have Micronesia. So Micronesia is a compact state of the United States. I can get into that in another video possibly, but compact basically means, very close relations with the United States. It's basically like the European Union led by the United States, right? And so it's these three islands, Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands. One of the state governors of China, of the Marshall Islands, has actually been reportedly in meetings with the Chinese Communist Party. So China is really exerting their influence in many of these countries. Next, what is Micronesia going to leave the compact and join? Probably not, because it just got renewed for 20 years, right? But you can see that these are possibilities, right? What about a lot of these other, poor countries, right? This goes back to another thing, right? Is why should we give aid to these countries? Why should we have military bases to these countries? Why do we care? If we don't care, China will care. China will give them money. China will build military bases there. We have to do it unless China will, right? This is sort of the concern with World War I, right? We could have probably had a more active role in the Pacific during World War I. We could have took those German islands, but Japan did it first. We didn't care. That came back to bite us later because Japan was then forward positioned in the Northern Mariana Islands, cutting off our access to the Philippines. They even invaded Guam, right, in World War II. So you can see all these little Pacific islands, you hop, skip, and a beat over, and now you're in Hawaii, right? You want Hawaii to get taken over? Sure. Even you could. Let's go further. Okay, sure. Hawaii. It's just like we took it over. It's a colony. Give independence back to the native Hawaiians. Blah blah blah. All right. Well, once you have Hawaii, you think they're gonna stop there? Right, and this is probably the last thing I'm going to say on this. I don't want to keep rambling on, but there's two real things people say about this, right? It's one, okay, well, China doesn't really want to do that. And two, well, China's just a paper tiger anyways. They would like to do that maybe, but, there's no way. There's no possibility they would do that. So you want to underestimate your enemy? That's really what you want to do? Underestimate your enemy? I'd rather overestimate my enemy. Okay, so number one, yeah, the first one. We already established that they are an enemy. Read Unrestricted Warfare from the two Chinese colonels talking about how to, destroy America, basically, how to fight America in a war. How to, once we defeat America in a war, we're going to use America for extra living space. It's right in there in the book. Written by, PLA officers. They are our enemy. And I don't underestimate the enemy. They could be a paper tiger. This would be amazing. But there's this thing like, there's a certain amount of people in the government and society, they're interested in foreign policy, right? Interested in national security. The president, the government, they have many teams for different things. The president has economic advisors. The president has national security advisors. You say, oh, we can't focus on these things. We need to focus on internal issues. Why? Are we that stupid or something? We can't focus on different things? The president, internal issues, leave it to your economic advisors, to the Secretary of the Interior, leave it to those guys, National security advisors, Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, right? Department of State, those sorts of things. So, you have people dedicated to national security, right? You can't tell those guys who are dedicated to national security, hey, we don't actually need you. China's not a threat, guys. Just relax. No, these guys, it's their job, right? So, they might be overplaying it. They might be overestimating the problem. That's their job, and we should listen to those guys. It's like you can say, okay, well, they can analyze all they want, but the president doesn't have to listen to them. Well, they should. Because we already established China's the enemy. We have nothing else to do with our military except protect the American people. The one job of the government is to protect the American people. I don't believe in, big government solutions for things. I don't believe in, having big healthcare or welfare state, anything like that. The only job of the government is to protect the lives of the American citizens, to protect the freedom of the American citizens, right? So our freedom cannot be protected with a global adversary like China trying to dominate the world. I mean, anything you buy with electronics from China, China's collecting your data. That's an assault on your freedom right there. And then if they take over the world, you're not going to have freedom, right? And it's just obvious. So you have this power out there. They want to take over the world. It's obvious. You have people in the government. They want to secure America, they're there for America's national security. They theorize, okay, this is how we're gonna, best protect. We shouldn't ignore them, right? We shouldn't ignore that what they say is we need to contain China. You might say they're a paper tiger. They might be. But why underestimate? It's like you're playing with cards, right? It's like, oh, just give them Taiwan, see what they'll do. The next is Philippines. Oh, that's fine. It's still kind of far away. Once they get to Palau, once they get to Guam, that's a bit close. Then we'll do something. Just stop them now, dude. Just do some deterrence. Deterrence is the cheapest way. Avoiding the war in general with deterrence is the cheapest possible way to do it. Once they have Taiwan, they're going to be more powerful. So you want to fight the war do you want to fight the war now, where they're weak? Or you want to fight the war later, where they're more powerful, where they have more land, where we're going to have to invade more islands, where we're going to have to get more of our young soldiers killed fighting the communists. When you take your pick, we can just maintain the status quo. The status quo might cost some billions of dollars, whatever. Or we sacrifice hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of lives to do it. I think the answer is very obvious. If we're overestimating them, that's fine. At least it only costs money and not lives.